was thinking during the break, I don't know how many people went and thanked all of these gals that were helpful to me, but I was thinking about the church sent me down to a singing school in Austin, Texas when I was 15 years old. And when I got back, one of the young men met me and said, you know, how did you like it? I said, oh man, it was really good. And this was after I'd led singing that Sunday. And he said, well, do you think you could still get your money back? So, speaking of our younger years and our youth, I don't know about you guys, but there were things in my youth that I probably should not, I can tell you for sure, I should not have done things. And I hung out with people that probably weren't a very good influence, they were not a very good influence on me. And later on in life, a few years later, I went back to a high school reunion. And when I went back to the high school reunion, this was still, you know, 5 years out of school, so most of these people had gone to college or were not married yet or were in early stages of marriage. And so when I went back to that, you know, there was drinking and partying and things going on that would have been kind of a carryover over from the high school years. And I remember feeling pressured by others to be involved in things that I used to would have thought nothing of being involved in, but now I'm looking back on it and thinking, you know, that's probably not a good thing. I don't think I want to do that. But there's still at that point in our lives kind of this pressure that comes that, oh, come on, you know, are you too good for us? Or, you know, those kind of things, those pressures, those insight. And pressuring us to be a part of that again. And I don't know, you guys have probably experienced that in different ways, in different areas, maybe with family, maybe with friends, maybe in social circles that you hung out with, and that feeling of being pressured into something that maybe you don't want to be a part of anymore. That's what Peter is dealing with this morning in our verses of 1 Peter chapter 4, the first 11 verses of this chapter. And as we look at these verses, remember that Peter is trying to get us to understand something. The message that he has is, you need to choose. Are you going to follow Jesus, or are you going to continue walking in the ways of the world? And no matter what your past was, your present is the same for all of us. We have a choice. Every one of us has a choice. Some of us, the choice is very hard. Some is very easy. But the choice still remains for all of us. The longer you stay away from things and don't participate in it, the easier that decision becomes. But there are other decisions. There are other things. And we often don't think about it, but we put other things on the throne instead of Jesus. We put our jobs, which is a good thing. You know, making money and earning money is important. I was visiting with Mike a few minutes ago about it's hard to get employees right now because there's a lot of people that just don't want to work because you can make money from the government more than you can working, so why go to work, you know? And that's one side of that. But we can also go the other way in becoming so consumed with making money and jobs and importance of it that we forget what's truly important. Sometimes family. Family is very good. I mean, there's a lot of good things, but sometimes we can elevate our family to a point where Jesus takes second to them. And that would be a bad thing. Not the family itself, but the position we put it in. Think about anything you want. It could be a car, it could be a boat, it could be a house, it can be anything that we put above God. That's what we're struggling with. And we all face this every day. Every one of us has to make a decision. Am I going to allow my desire for entertainment to trump my desire for a relationship with God? Whatever it might be. So, looking at that, we start out here at the very end of chapter 3. And I'm going to start with verse 21. It says, and this water, talking about the water like from Noah and the flood, And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want you to key into that last part right there. The water, it's not that important. We went down to the Yakima River and baptized. I could have done so right here in this or in a swimming pool or anywhere else. But it's not the water. There's no magical potion. It's not holy water. It's a clear conscience, he says. And he goes on that it's not the water that saves us. It says it saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Amen. It's because of his death, his burial, and his resurrection that baptism means anything. It's a parallel to his death and burial and resurrection. Because we die to ourselves and we are raised to walk a new life. For those of you that are watching online, I need to tell you that our video cut out, and so I am re-recording this so that I can publish the full sermon online for your sake. So bear with me as I recap these things. If we skip down to chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourself also with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin." Now, we all know that Jesus did not have sin. He was sinless. So his death was different than ours in that we would be dying for our own sins. But Jesus died for our sins instead. So it's not in that like manner, but in the manner that when we die to something, when we pay the cost for something, who wants to go backwards? Who wants to take that and relive it? He goes on to explain this, and he says in verse 2, "As a result, he does not live the rest of his earthly life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God." What he wants us to see is that you've already died to this. You've already made that choice. Going back to chapter 3, when we are baptized into Christ, we die to our old self. We're no longer living for that anymore. So from then on, as a new believer, as a follower of Christ, we are now living for God's will instead of our own evil desires. And so he's saying to us, there's going to be a cost. You may suffer. You may suffer in the body, in the flesh. But there is a reward even for that. And he goes on to talk in verse 3, "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry." He's pointing out that we already were there. That's where we were at. We've already spent enough time. We've wasted enough time there. Don't go back. Don't go back and try to live that life and forget what cost you've already paid. We've died to that. Why do we live in it any longer? Paul says in Romans chapter 6. We don't want to be there any longer. So what do we want? What is it God wants? What is God's will? When we compare the two, we have two wills that are battling each other. Our will or God's will. And we all know that the Creator, of course, knows what's best. And he had it from the very beginning, a plan. His plan was that we would have a relationship with him. That we would be one with him. And that seems kind of odd to say. But God's desire is to be like it was in the garden when he was walking with Adam and Eve. That's his desire for us today, is to have a relationship with him. We're not going to have that relationship here on this earth, but we begin it here. We start that relationship, and then in heaven we will be able to enjoy that relationship with him in that day. But the point that he wants us to see here is that there's somebody that's trying to draw us back into that. Ultimately, we know who that somebody is. That somebody is Satan. But he uses any tools that he can use. Any person, any being. And so he says, they think it strange that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of dissipation. So the same thing that you used to do and that they are still participating in, they want to draw you back into that. They want you to fall into that same hole that you used to be in with them. And he's saying, don't do it. Don't fall for it. Don't go back to that. Instead, live for God. Do His will. Live as His child, as His new creature. We are recreated in Christ when we are baptized with Him. When we start our life anew, we no longer are living the old life. We look at that list sometimes of the debauchery and the things of this world. And sometimes we go through that and we say, well, let's see here. I don't really struggle with debauchery. I don't really have a problem with lust. I'm not a drunkard. I haven't never participated in the orgies or carousing and detestable idolatry. How could that apply to me? I don't have any idols. But I want you to think about it for a minute. It may not be something directly from that list. But sometimes we put other things before God. Sometimes we allow other things to become a priority in our lives. And sometimes we look at them and we see things and we might even come to the conclusion that it's a good thing. Like, for instance, our family or our friends, our job, other things that we see that are important, and we put those up on a pedestal and we think about those and we decide, that is important to me. And sometimes we actually get it reversed and we make that our priority. That's what's so important. And when we do that, that's when it becomes an idol. So even if you haven't struggled with these other items, almost all of us struggle with that one. We almost all have a problem with idolatry. We put something else ahead of God. He becomes second to something in our lives. And like I said, it's not always a bad thing. It might even be good things. But when they become more important to us than God, then we've got our priorities wrong. And he's calling us back to this. In verse 5 he says, but they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. That living and the dead, those who are living, those who are dead will both stand before God on the judgment day. But I think it's a little bit more than that, because he goes on in verse 6 and he says, for this is the reason the gospel was preached, even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to men in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. I believe the author here wants us to see that we can be judged by the body. We can be judged by others in this world, friends, family, those who might look at us and criticize us, or enemies, or anybody else. We might be judged by them in this body. But that's not really what's important. What's important is that we choose to follow God, and that we're living for Him. They might make fun of us. They might tease us. They might give us a hard time. But that's not what's important. He says, again there in verse 6, for this is the reason the gospel was preached. Gospel was preached because of this very thing. So that, he says, and even to those who are now dead, so that they may be judged according to men in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. So we want to be those who live according to God in the Spirit. But he doesn't end there. He goes on. He says, the end of all things is near. Therefore be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. I want to pause here for just a minute and point something out. There's a lot of people that are capitalizing right now on the wars and the rumors of wars and the natural disasters that are happening, and claiming that these are the end times, that this is now coming. I want you to recognize something here, that these are things that have been happening throughout the history of man. These aren't new things. These predictions have happened many, many, many times over and over again. I'm not saying that these are not the end times. It very well may be. And I think we should always be prepared. But I think it's a danger when we try to predict that these are the end times, because if we do that and then nothing happens, sometimes people lose faith and they quit following God because of wrong motives, wrong desires. I think what we really need to capitalize on is the fact that no matter what the day and age is, no matter what year it is or how far along we are, it's end days. The end days are near. 2,000 years ago, Peter is saying the end is near. We don't know when the end will be. It might be today. You never can tell. But I believe that we can be prepared for that end day. And I think that's exactly what he's pointing out. And he goes on in verse 8, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. This verse has given me trouble in the past, and understanding and really knowing what he's talking about. When we talk about love covering over a multitude of sins, what's he dealing with? I'd like to go to 1 Corinthians in chapter 13, if we could, for just a moment. And if you'd like to turn there with me, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I'd like to read a few verses here. He's speaking of love. And in verse 4, he says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. This list of what love is and is not, that's exactly how love covers a multitude of sins. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. We all sin. We hurt each other. We say things that we don't really mean. Sometimes we say things accidentally that hurt someone. Sometimes we say things out of anger or frustration and we hurt someone. But that's not love. When we truly love someone and care about them, that love covers a multitude of sins. And that's what he's getting at here in verse 8. When he says that because love covers over a multitude of sins, he says, love each other deeply. Not just a surface love, not just, I love you, bro, but a true, heartfelt love. I love you enough to die for you. I care about you enough to sacrifice for you. Love covers a multitude of sins. Because even when we make mistakes, when we love one another, they know that we're not against them, we're for them. We use this in our counseling quite a bit. Because a lot of times when we have two people that are fighting and not getting along and having some struggles in their marriages or in their relationships with others, most often it's two people that care about each other. They wouldn't have gotten married if they didn't care about one another. But something has happened. A lot of times, it's quite a few little things that have happened. And then once you get to that point, it's hard to look past what you know to accept what's there. Because, you see, we truly care about one another, but yet we say things hurtfully. Sometimes we do things and say things that we don't mean or we shouldn't have said or done. Sometimes we have to remind people that you are two good-willed people that care about each other. Let's start there instead of starting in the hole where he said or she said or they did or they did this. Instead, start with you care about one another. You love one another. Let's start at that grace. And I think that's exactly what Peter is pointing out here, that we are to love one another deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sin. And then he goes on, he says, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. I think this was kind of an interesting thought here, because when you look at it, and he says here that offer hospitality to one another without grumbling, that's one gift that we have, is a gift of hospitality to one another. But when he goes on and he says, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others. We're all different. We all have different gifts. We all have blessings from God in the form of gifts to pass on to someone else. But if we don't pass those on, then they don't get to the benefit. They don't get to enjoy the benefit of those gifts that God has given us. And he says, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. Rhonda pointed this out to me. I hadn't seen this, but I thought it was kind of interesting. She said, what does it mean when he says this? And I thought to myself, that's not in my Bible. That's not the version I am. But so I went back and I reread it. And you know what? It is in mine. It says, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. So I had to do a little digging to figure out what he was talking about here. And I really believe what he's trying to point out is that grace comes in different forms. There's different ways that we can administer that faith, that grace faithfully to others through our different gifts, through the different things that he's given us. And if we can truly allow God's grace to work through us and reach others, what kind of a blessing could we be to those who are hurting, those who are in pain? And he goes on in verse 11, if anyone speaks, he should do it as one speaking the very words of God. Some of you may remember the bracelets and the sayings, WWJD, what would Jesus do? I think this is kind of what he's getting at here, is this idea that what would Jesus say? What would God say? If we allowed the very words of God to come through us and to other people, what would it mean? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? And so Peter says here, he says that they are speaking our very words of God. If anyone serves, he should do it with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Peter wants us to recognize something here. He wants us to recognize that there is a world out there that wants to draw us back in, tempt us, cause us to fall, to stumble, to lose faith. Satan is using the world to try to trip us up, to cause us failures. And Peter's saying, don't let it happen. Don't be sucked back into that. You died to that. You're no longer that person. You're now trying to do the will of God, choosing God's will over man's will. That's what we will be judged for in the end. And he's saying here, he wants us to enjoy the ability to live in God's will, because who else knows better how we should live? So in these last words, that he would provide, that God provides so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. His desire is for us to allow him to work through us so that he can be glorified through the things that he does in us and through us. It's our choice. We can choose to live as the world does, to enjoy, if you want to call it that, the things of the world. Or choose to live in God, choose to do God's will, and live for Him. And the choice is ours. The choice is yours. Who do you want to live for? Do you want to live for Satan, for the world, for self, for others? Or would you like to live for God and do His will, so that He will receive the glory and the honor for the things that we do? I believe that all of us has a desire to walk in the way of the Lord, to follow Him and to do His will. And I think that's exactly what Peter is challenging us to do. I hope you will make the choice to follow Him and to do His will.